Let's talk about Monk Allegretti over in Chicago. His actual name, by the way, was James B. Allegretti Policheri, Policheri. He was called Monk. Allegretti was born in Olivito, Sitra, Italy, in May 31, 1905. He arrived 8 months later to the U.S. His mother became a naturalized citizen. He never bothered, which would prove to be a big mistake later on. Although, well, we'll go into it, but they tried to deport him, but even that didn't work. This guy was born under a lucky stars in a lot of ways. He was, despite what he said, a pimp. And later, he was a power on the North Side, starting in the 50s through the early 60s, mid 60s. He ran one of the biggest gambling rings in the city. He had a stranglehold on Rush Street, the bar scene on Rush Street. He was a prolific bookmaker who started his career. He was a union extortionist, is how he started out. He got locked up for that in 1933. 19 more arrests followed. They ranged for everything: narcotics peddling, counterfeiting. He counterfeited. There was a shortage of sugar during World War II. And at first, he would steal these coupons. You had to get, every family got so many coupons for milk, sugar, whatever was in short supply. And as far as food was, fresh vegetables, meat. And at first he would just steal them, and then he thought, well, just make them. So he made his own coupons, and it isn't funny actually. Anyway, they got it from narcotics, bootlegging, bribery, loan sharking, bribery of a public official, conspiracy, morals charge, bombing, and on murder. He was arrested for all these things, but remarkably, he only did time once in his life. He had enormous private investments in, just about every hotels and restaurants, taverns, strip clubs, nightclubs, two meat companies, a produce firm. Um, he was a money machine. Mayor Daley ordered an investigation into the Simon Meat Provision Company, 210 W Street. The mayor believed that it was owned by Allegretti, and it probably was. Allegretti, Joe DeVarco, Jackie DeLecchi, Cerrone. They also owned the C&B Meat Company at 1136 Randolph Street, and they were the reason Daley wanted this investigated was they were supposed to be selling horse meat in places which you could get for almost nothing. At one time, there were livestocks in Chicago, and you could just go over there and get a horse because usually just grinding the horses up for glue and God knows what else. And I guess he figured, looks like beef. Allegretti, he lived large. He ate too much. He drank too much. He had dozens of women around him on retainers. Eventually, he had diabetes, and eventually he lost the use of his. He went blind in one of his eyes from diabetes. Just had no restraint. When he was pulled before the McClellan Committee, yeah, he took the fifth 23 times, and he was combative, nasty, and foul. I bet you they were. It's on YouTube, and I'll bet you when he left the room, the senators were really pleased to get rid of him. In 1935, he had a bar, a saloon on West Grand Avenue, and there was a murder in there. The details are sketchy. He probably wasn't involved with that one. 5 years later, in 1944, Allegretti and his second wife, Florence, they owned another tavern at 669 North State Street in a partnership with this gangster, Vincenzo James D'Angelo. D'Angelo, he was an illegal alien in the U.S. He was a primary suspect in the 1935 murder of State Representative Albert Priganano, Priganano. They butchered him without cause. D'Angelo disappeared from the earth on February 24th, 1944. But after an anonymous call to the police, someone claimed they saw four guys drag D'Angelo into a car and stuff him in the trunk. It was his wife's car, it turns out. They found his corpse in the trunk of his wife's car on March 11, 1944. The car had been parked there for about 2 weeks. He was badly beaten. Kicks to the stomach, fractured skull. They had wrapped him around in a clothesline, a noose around his neck. Aside from that, police said D'Angelo had been tortured each day for several days. They knew that. They figured he was dead for about 2-ish weeks. Why? The speculation was that he was involved in a gangland dispute over profits from the black market, government rationing cheese, You know, with these things, who knows? These guys, they kill each other in 5 seconds. During World War II, Allegretti, as I said, was in the sugar stamp coupon business. He was a counterfeiter, and he made punch boards as well. Uh, Punch boards were, I don't know why they're illegal. I think they're legal in some states. You paid pennies for these things, and you pull the thing on a board, and if you won, let's say, I don't know, free candy bar or something like that. I don't know that they were. They got around the thing for the law by not paying cash back. In some instances, I guess in other instances, they paid cash back. Allegretti was suspected of entering to Ross Priault. In the 1950s, he was rich enough to finance high-item burglaries. He had his guys muscle in protection all up and down Rush Street and across the city, really. He made a lot of money from protection, which was real simple because it was very profitable. There was no expenditure. He had goons go to a bar, or it didn't matter. It could be a nail salon. And he said, look, I need 200 a month, which is about what he got in those days. We're talking about the mid-50s. But, 200 a month, no overhead. How many stores did he shake down? So he became very, very rich. His guys also went to nightclubs, hotels, saloons, and they made a deal. We'll leave you alone, but our women are going to work here at your location. And a lot of people who own these things thought, is it worth fighting these guys? Fine, let the women work here. And his Allegretti's prostitutes, they ran the range. Now he had girls in a bus station who made $20 a trick rather, and then on the high-end hotels, he had these girls making $700 an hour sometimes. And bear in mind, that's a 1950s price. His men pushed their way into the bartenders union, the waitresses union. I didn't know there was a waitresses union. And they ran a 3-state car theft ring for him, for the Monk. And then these cars were exported down to Central America. Really, really. Actually, today it's still very expensive to buy a car in Central or South America. I remember when I lived in South America, you could buy a Russian piece of crap which wouldn't get out of the driveway for nothing. It was really inexpensive, but you could, if you really wanted a new American car. There were guys, usually they worked for the Navy because the Navy had access to these things, and you'd go and you'd pay, I don't know, by American standards, a lot. But let's say I'm just throwing numbers around here. Some car in the States you paid $50,000. Let's say that, and there you paid 60-something thousand, but it was cash. You had to pay cash. And so he did the same thing, but in a lot of other countries. Outside, by the way, and as I said, he had investments in Hot Springs, Arkansas. He owned a casino over there. He owned some spas. He owned a hotel. Allegretti's top guys included Frank Hot Dog, I'm going to go slow on this one, Liciandrello, his brother Joey, who they called Ruffy, Sam Speary, his other brother. They functioned as gambler overseers on the north side. Sam was the part owner manager of Swing City, 444 Chicago Ave, which was for a time the most notorious vice joint in the city, which is really saying something. I mean, Chicago vice in the 40s, 50s was impressive. Some of these clubs are really impressive. And this one, apparently, from what I've read in the Crime Commission reports, this was really something. Where they became famous was 3 doctors went there to have a drink and goof around, and they gave them knockout drops and robbed them blind. That caused such a stink, the club closed. Joe Ruffy, his wife Rose, was Tony Arcado's first cousin. Joey died in 1964. He had a blood thing going on. He was also active in the north side. He tried to get a piece of the Primrose Path Tavern. It was really kind of mobbed up place. There was a second one that opened later on in L.A., where they ran prostitutes out of both of these places. But the mob bosses were already being paid, so they backed him out of that. His other top guys was this clown Dave Falzone. Falzone was the debonair around town kind of guy, but he was a good front man. Everyone thought he was legal, so he was a good front man. The other one was Louis Darlick. Darlick was the brother of Touhy gangster Eddie Darlick. Eddie Darlick escaped from Stateville Prison with Touhy and a bunch of other guys in 1942. His brother Kazimir Darlick, the family was from Poland, hence Kazimir, probably planted guns at a flagpole, and they had this trustee come in. What was his? Piercy Campbell. Piercy Campbell had been involved. You know, there's a similarity here with Eddie Darlick. It's the same sort of crime. Both of these guys had been involved with an armed robbery, and in both cases, a cop walked in, and in both cases, the guy who was leading the gang, who was older than Darlick was during the robbery, or Piercy Campbell was, shot the cop dead. So these guys got life for that. Again, it's two different cases. Darlick went away, I forgot what year, so it was like 20 years difference between the two crimes. But both of them got slammed away for life, and because they were there when the policeman was murdered. So I guess that's how it goes. Anyway, they got the guns, and Darlick was, as I said, he was serving life. He had shot a policeman. He wasn't there. He was robbing a tavern. This guy, Robert Banks, actually fired the shots. And so Darlick went away for a long time. Fourth brother, Paul Darlick, he was 17 years old in 1943. He was trying to rob a store at 1215 West 18th Street. He threw a brick through the store window. He wasn't aware it had one of those ringing bell alarm. He reached in quickly without looking, and he apparently slashed his arm from the wrist up to his shoulder. And he didn't get anything, and he staggered away. He slashed on a piece of glass, and he staggered away, and he dropped dead from a loss of blood just a few blocks away. We'll go back to Hot Dog Lisiandrello. He had been on the north side a long, long time. He had a long police record going back to 1936. He did 6 months in Juliet for armed robbery, and then in 1942 he went back on rape. He raped somebody and attempting to, quote, force a protection club. I don't know what that. Oh, I see. On small north side merchants. So he went back to prison for that. He and Joey DeVarco killed Nick DeJean in California in 1940. That was a big murder. It's a big stink. It involved dope. It was not good. After it happened, Lisiandrello, he complained loudly and often that he wasn't worth the trip to go to California to kill DeJean because DeVarco got more money, and after he was killed, DeVarco went way up the ladder, and he just thought, well, it should have been me and not him. In 1951, Allegretti was a prime suspect behind the September 25 murder of Marvin Bass. Bass was killed on the same night that the Chicago police detective William Drury was murdered by the mob. The Drury case is really interesting. I don't know what... I think he was an honest man who made dumb mistakes. But anyway, they were both killed on the same night because they were both going to testify before the Kefauver Committee. Bass was a Republican nominee for Circuit Court Clerk. He was murdered near his home on Orchard Street and North Avenue. I know where that is. And he had agreed to exchange information with Kefauver that they agreed would embarrass Democratic candidate for Cook County Sheriff Daniel Tubbo Gilbert. So Gilbert, pardon the expression, ducked a bullet on that one. But what isn't known is, I can't remember his name, Ray Brennan, a great reporter for the Chicago Tribune, flew to Washington. They called in Tubbo Gilbert, so-called the world's richest cop, and they said, look, you're running for county sheriff, so we're Cook County Sheriff, big important job. We're going to have a closed-door session, we won't make it public. And it turns out in this session that Tubbo Gilbert admitted he gambled every day, and that, he explained, was how he had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. You know, a top officer at that time made around $25,000, $30,000. This guy's got damn near $1 million in the bank. I think he got the money from being paid off from the mob because he looked the other way a lot. But anyway, he said it was gambling. He said he was just remarkably lucky. So they let him go. Ray Brennan, he went down. It's in the section near the Capitol building. It used to be a really crappy neighborhood. It's where the printing press is. It's an enormous building, just enormous. I don't know, 400,000 foot building. And he went in there and he had a scowl on his face because they stay. You just can't wander in. He said, I'm here for the goddamn Tubbo Gilbert report. Why did you people say? And they, oh, I'm sorry. And then they ran and got him Tubbo Gilbert's report, and he published it in the newspapers the next day. They tried to put him in jail for that, but it didn't work. Marvin Bass, his relationship to Allegretti, the reason they thought Allegretti might have something to do with this is that Bass, as an attorney, had represented a Cuban Village nightclub, which was owned by Allegretti secretly, and money were being filtered out of there into Allegretti's pocket. So maybe, who knows. The mob's wire service in the Midwest, around, say, Illinois and other states, in the mid-1950s was run by Allegretti, uh, Little Caesar DeVarco, and Anthony Tony Mac DeMonte. DeMonte is a really interesting guy. I started to research him, but I don't have enough time. He had ties to the Rockford, Illinois mob. He was involved with the Milwaukee mob. From what I could figure out, he seemed to represent the Midwest mobs to the mafia in Sicily. So, interesting guy. Anyway, according to police, Charles Cherry Nose Gio and Frank Martati, Frankie Diamond, were murdered by the mob for a variety of reasons. But one of those reasons was their attempt to strong arm the group I just mentioned, DeMonte, DeVarco, and Allegretti, into getting them a higher percentage for the wire services. And they thought, no, it's easier, faster, better to kill these guys. In 1959, Judy Kramer, she was 16 years old, I think not a stable kid. She got in a lot of trouble. She became an inmate in the city-run juvenile home, and she said that George Alex, Gus Alex's brother, who, believe it or not, was on the staff at this place, probably is a no-show job. I mean, could you think of a worse person to be on the staff of a juvenile home? He ended up pimping her out, she said, to several gangsters, including Allegretti. When she said that, they locked up Allegretti. However, he was discharged as a defendant, and it was a big case on the sex charge because he was able to prove there was insufficient evidence, and he was able to, well, he wasn't actually able to prove. He had an alibi that said he was in Miami, and this girl said these sex acts took place November 9th to the 16th, 1959. He said he was with Mike Myers, the owner of Mickey Murphy's, a tavern at 51 East Ohio Street, and an old rum runner. He had been a rum runner in the Capone organization, and he testified, no, it couldn't possibly be true. 51 East Ohio Street. When I had to spend a lot of time, I was writing a book in Chicago, and they paid me to go and do my research, and there was something called the Rock and Roll McDonald's, and across the street, almost positive, it's on East Ohio Street. I stayed at the hotel there, and that McDonald's was my office. I spent 2 weeks in that place. I'd go out with a cab and go explore what I needed to find out, and then I'd come back and do my writing there because the rooms were, oh my God, were they small. So anyway, Allegretti said he denied, he was accused of blowing up Gene Autry was a cowboy star, put his name on hotels, Sahara Inn Motel in Schiller Park in 1963. And Allegretti said, that's outrage, I would never do such a thing. So they locked him up and 36 other guys for questioning. And he continues with this stuff. Allegretti, I have known nothing about it. And stupidly, before the press, he says, I'll take a lie detector test. I'll prove to you. The cops couldn't get to that lie detector fast. I mean, they were falling all over. They came back and said, here you go. Here's the lie. And he said, well, maybe, I don't know. And he changed his mind. He withdrew the offer about the lie detector test. Allegretti angrily, if you look in the newspaper, he denied being a pimp. He said it had nothing to do with Vice, but Vice is where he made his cash. It's what made him rich. In one bust of a prostitution ring he oversaw, police said the mobsters controlled not only prostitutes, and we're talking about Allegretti, controlled not only prostitutes, the madams who ran the prostitutes, the procurers, the guy who went out in the street and brought them in, 15 cab drivers who were on his payroll who would bring customers into him to make sure the customer, and they'd get back out. To avoid arrest, the cab drivers would take the fee for the girls. And in this case, in this particular ring, they charged $25 to $150 per girl. The ring grossed, according to the IRS, $2 to $3 million a year in 1965 dollars. And it was coordinated from an apartment at 1350 North LaSalle Street. Allegretti took about half the profits for himself. And his ground guy was someone who I don't know much about because I couldn't find anything about him. Sam Constanzo, Contanzo, Costanzo. He was as I said, a degenerate gambler who lost, they don't know, hundreds of thousands of dollars gambling. He just couldn't pick a horse that would win or a number that would pull up. In 1965, Allegretti was finally sent to federal prison for 7 years after he exhausted all these court appeals. He made a last-minute attempt to avoid going to court. He said he was at death's door. So the judge said, really? And he called in these FBI agents, and they said, well, we've been following him, and this is what they read his schedule. They said his life consisted of he slept all day and get up at night, and he'd visit Rush Street night spots up until the eve of when he was supposed to go to jail. They said he, quote, drank conspicuous nightly consumption of Scotch whiskey and heavily spiced Italian foods. And then it goes on about the women he was with and so forth. So it contradicted his thing about how he was going to die if he went to prison. He'd gone to prison because he was involved with this idiotic deal of buying stolen liquor, and it was just so amateur, so dumb, and a lot of guys went to jail with him over that. In 1966, Allegretti was serving a 7-year sentence in Terre Haute federal prison. His second wife, Florence, I don't know how this happened, was fatally burned to death in this huge fire in her bedroom in the 34th floor of a 40-floor apartment, apparently, at 1300 North Lakeshore Drive, which I think is a pretty nice thing. Apparently, she may have been smoking a cigarette, but anyway, she was burned so badly they couldn't identify her. So they're just assuming that was her dead in the bed. It was a flash fire. The fireman rather, said, the fire chief, it was probably from a cigarette. But it caused $20,000 in damage they had in this 10-room apartment. It's just odd, just an odd thing. In about 1960-61, the federal government made 2 attempts to deport him because, again, he never became a citizen. So using information they had that he had served several months for auto theft in state prison in 1920, but his lawyers hired private detectives, and they found out, well, that's false. He was being confused with this guy, Michael Bonbon Allegretti, whose actual name was Peter Allegretti, who worked for Capone. Actually, he worked for Capone's brother. Allegretti had been arrested for counterfeiting, they found out, prohibition violations. And they questioned him in several mob murders, but there were no convictions, so it didn't do any good to get him tossed out on moral turpitude. The charge he had, the liquor stealing thing, it would just be easier to have him pushed out on moral turpitude charges, but that doesn't really fit into the category, whiskey hijacking. It just doesn't work that way. So what they found out was Allegretti had left the country on a private jet June 26, 1957, and then he returned to Italy, and then he came back on a private flight into the U.S. So doing that, he failed to comply with regulations that persons living in the U.S. who are not citizens and re-enter the U.S., they first have to obviously check with the government. He didn't do that. So any alien who commits a crime within 5 years of his most recent entry into the United States, in his case coming and going illegally, would be convicted of 2 crimes. But the case was dropped, basically. We just weren't able to the government wasn't able to find witnesses. It was just one wet sandwich after another. I mean, they couldn't do anything right. Our government isn't all that good with deporting mobsters. It was a weapon in the 1920s. There is a case, I haven't read it in years, I'm going to say between 30 and 33, if you check the Tribune, there's instances where the federal marshals came from D.C. into Chicago. They just rounded guys up. No trial, no hearing. Round them up, put their ass on a boat, and sent them back to Italy. I can't believe they got away with it. I don't think anybody really cared. People were fed up at that time with Capone and all this stuff. They tried using the McClellan Committee and the Keyfarms, used deportation well. They got Luciano, quite a few other big names out, but it's so involved, and the judges are very reluctant to agree to have somebody taken out of the country unless you're just a name who's got to go. So not the best way to get rid of these people. So Allegretti goes to prison, and he does his time. I think I said 7 years. He gets out. The day he gets out, his brother, Ben, who went by the original name, Ben Policieri, flew down to Springfield, Missouri to pick him up at the prison when he got paroled. They hopped on a plane. He had a heart attack on the plane and died when they touched down in Chicago.